The Galactic Educational Consortium Xenohistory Institute occupied 17 floating platforms above the crystalline clouds of Nexus Prime, each one dedicated to the noble pursuit of understanding how civilizations managed to spectacularly fail at becoming galactic powers. It was, by all accounts, the most prestigious academic facility for studying developmental disasters in the known galaxy, a place where the brightest minds gathered to dissect the corpses of civilizations that had somehow managed to evolve thumbs but not common sense. Professor Yith-Ka adjusted her 6 crystalline viewing organs and regarded her class with the sort of academic satisfaction that only comes from knowing you're about to explain why someone else's entire species was cosmically embarrassing. The amphitheater hummed with the sort of intellectual energy that advanced civilizations practically radiated. 12 different species, all of whom had achieved faster-than-light travel before discovering gunpowder, which was apparently the sensible way to do things. The Altarian delegation sat in perfect mathematical formation, their chrome exoskeletons gleaming with the smugness that came from having invented computational matrices before fire. Next to them, the Valdric Collective's hive mind representatives maintained that eerie synchronized breathing that suggested they'd solved collective consciousness while most species were still figuring out agriculture. The ethereal drift beings flickered between dimensions with the casual arrogance of a people who had mastered reality manipulation as children. And then there was the human. He sat in the back corner, not because he was shy, mind you, but because he'd apparently arrived early and chosen the seat with the best tactical overview of all exit, which was peculiar behavior for someone who was supposedly here through the consortium's primitive species observation program, a charitable initiative designed to let developing civilizations witness actual competence in action. The human had been introduced simply as Earth's representative, a designation that had prompted polite academic interest from species who collected primitive curiosities the way children collected shiny rock. He appeared remarkably unremarkable, bipedal, carbon-based, possessing the standard mammalian configuration that evolution seemed to favor when it was feeling particularly unimaginative. What was remarkable was how he'd somehow convinced the consortium to let him attend lectures on galactic civilization development, despite representing a species that had only recently figured out how to leave their own atmosphere without exploding. Professor Yith-Ka's mandibles clicked with anticipation as she activated the holographic display. Today, class, we examine Case Study 47B, the Terran Problem, a comprehensive analysis of how not to achieve space travel. The display shimmered to life, showing a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in what most civilized species considered the galactic equivalent of the suburbs. The assembled students shifted with the sort of eager attention that academic sadists inspired when promising to dissect someone else's failures. The Zephyrian scholar extended several tentacles to take notes, while the Omnath representative's crystalline form hummed with scholarly delight. Even the notoriously unimpressed hegemony observers seemed engaged, which was saying something for beings who considered entropy a fascinating philosophical concept rather than an existential threat. The human, meanwhile, had produced what appeared to be an actual paper notebook, an artifact so charmingly primitive that several students briefly wondered if he was planning to start a fire with it later. He held what looked suspiciously like a wooden writing implement, and began taking notes with the sort of methodical precision that suggested either deep academic interest or someone making a very detailed inventory. The Terran species, Professor Yith-Ka began, her tone carrying that particular academic contempt reserved for civilizations that had somehow missed obvious developmental shortcuts, represents perhaps the most inefficient approach to technological advancement we've yet encountered. While most intelligent species develop faster than light communication within their first millennium of tool use, humans spent nearly 6,000 years perfecting increasingly elaborate methods of hitting each other with sticks. A ripple of amused academic superiority passed through the classroom. The Valdric Collective's representatives shared a harmonious chuckle that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, while the Altarians' optical sensors flickered with what passed for mirth among beings who had mathematically proven that humor could be reduced to algorithmic efficiency. The human continued writing, his pen an actual ink dispensing device that would have been museum-worthy among any civilized species, scratching across the paper with surprising rapidity. His expression remained politely attentive, like someone genuinely interested in learning about primitive technological development, which, considering he was supposedly the primitive one in question, suggested either remarkable self-deprecation or something considerably more interesting. Professor Yithka gestured toward the holographic Earth with one of her lower appendages, while maintaining eye contact with her students. Observe their approach to space exploration. Chemical propulsion. As if the optimal solution to escaping a gravity well was to strap explosives to a metal cylinder and hope for the best. The display showed various human spacecraft, crude, angular things that looked like they'd been assembled by civilizations that had confused engineering with controlled destruction. Most species achieve gravitic manipulation within centuries of achieving metallurgy, she continued, warming to her theme. The elegant solution is obvious. Manipulate space-time directly. Fold reality to your convenience. Step gracefully between stars as nature intended. But not humans. Oh no. They spent centuries perfecting the art of turning perfectly good planets into launch sites for elaborate fireworks displays. The ethereal drift representative phased slightly out of normal space-time in what might have been suppressed laughter. The gesture was so subtle that only beings who had mastered dimensional physics could have detected it, which was rather the point. The human looked up from his notes, raising his hand with the sort of polite uncertainty that suggested he was about to ask for clarification on a particularly complex academic point. Professor Yithka paused, 6 crystalline eyes focusing on him with benevolent academic patience. Yeah, you have a question about your species' developmental challenges. The human smiled, a facial expression that most species found charmingly primitive, like watching a domesticated creature attempt communication. Just a small clarification, Professor. When you mention chemical propulsion, are you referring to the early chemical rockets, or are you including the fusion ramjet prototypes in that assessment? Professor Yithka's mandibles paused mid-click. Fusion, oh yes, the human said, flipping through his notebook with the casual air of someone checking their grocery list. The early chemical stuff was quite primitive. You're absolutely right. But the fusion system started coming online around, well, I suppose your galactic calendar would put it at about 15 standard cycles ago. Much more efficient. Though I suppose you might not have detailed records of our more recent developments. The classroom had grown remarkably quiet. The sort of quiet that suggested a room full of extremely intelligent beings suddenly reconsidering their assumptions about what exactly they were dealing with. The human went back to taking notes, apparently satisfied with his minor contribution to the academic discourse. His pen continued its methodical scratching across paper that was looking less like a primitive curiosity and more like a very thorough intelligence report. Professor Yithka found herself staring at the human with an uncomfortable mixture of academic interest and something that might have been the first stirrings of actual concern. Professor Yithka cleared her respiratory chambers with the sort of deliberate academic composure that suggested she was choosing to interpret the human's comment as charming naivety, rather than anything approaching actual concern. After all, primitive species occasionally stumbled onto moderately advanced concepts. It was like watching a particularly clever domesticated creature accidentally solve a puzzle meant for its betters. Oh yes, she said, her mandibles clicking in what passed for indulgent amusement among her species. Fusion ramjets. How ambitious of your people to attempt such theoretical construct. The holographic display shifted to show what the consortium's databases considered the pinnacle of human engineering. Crude chemical rockets that looked like they'd been designed by civilizations that had confused aerodynamics with wishful thinking. The issue, of course, Professor Yithka continued, gesturing toward the primitive spacecraft with obvious academic disdain, is that humans consistently chose the most resource-intensive, environmentally destructive approaches possible. Rather than developing elegant solutions, gravitic manipulation, dimensional folding, quantum tunneling, they opted to turn their homeworld into a launching pad for what essentially amounted to controlled explosion. The Altarian delegation hummed in harmonic agreement, their chrome exoskeletons reflecting the holographic flames in patterns that suggested mathematical appreciation for the elegant inefficiency of human failure. The Valdric Collective's hive mind representatives nodded in perfect synchronization, sharing the sort of collective smugness that came from having achieved interstellar travel before discovering the wheel. The human raised his hand again, this time with the sort of polite persistence that suggested he had more than one minor clarification to offer. Professor Yithka paused, her academic patience beginning to show the first hairline cracks of actual irritation. Another question about your species' developmental choices. Well, not exactly a question, the human said, consulting his notebook with the methodical precision of someone cross-referencing multiple sources. More of a timeline clarification. You mentioned that humans consistently chose resource-intensive approaches, but I'm wondering if your data accounts for the asteroid mining operations that began about 12 cycles ago. The classroom's ambient temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The ethereal drift representative flickered more rapidly between dimensions, which among their species typically indicated either deep philosophical contemplation or the quantum equivalent of nervous fidgeting. Professor Yithka's 6 crystalline eyes focused on the human with increasing intensity. Asteroid mining operations. Oh yes. The human replied, flipping through his notebook with casual efficient. Started small, naturally. A few automated extraction platforms around the inner system asteroids. But the operation expanded quite rapidly once we figured out how to process rare earth elements in zero gravity. Much more efficient than strip mining planets, as you can imagine. He paused, tapping his pen against the paper in a rhythm that somehow managed to sound ominous. Though I suppose your databases might not have tracked the more recent industrial development. The Zephyrian scholars' tentacles had stopped taking notes and were now writhing in what appeared to be either academic excitement or species-specific anxiety. The Omneth representative's crystalline form had shifted from its usual scholarly blue to a distinctly troubled amber, which among their people indicated the sort of cognitive dissonance that came from having fundamental assumptions challenged by inconvenient fact. Professor Yithka's mandibles clicked with increasing rapidity, a behavioral tic that among her species indicated either deep concentration or the academic equivalent of panic. And these mining operations, they would have required what sort of technological infrastructure? The human smiled with the sort of helpful enthusiasm typically displayed by beings who were genuinely eager to share educational information. Oh, the usual requirements for large-scale space-based industry. Fusion power plants, automated manufacturing systems, gravitational manipulation for cargo transport. Nothing too sophisticated by galactic standards, I'm sure. The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with rooms full of extremely intelligent beings, suddenly realizing they might have been operating under fundamentally flawed assumptions. It was the academic equivalent of discovering that your carefully constructed theoretical framework had been built on a foundation of wishful thinking and species-specific arrogance. The human continued consulting his notebook, apparently oblivious to the growing atmosphere of scholarly unease. Actually, that reminds me of another small discrepancy in your timeline. You mentioned that humans only recently figured out how to leave their atmosphere without exploding, but I believe your data might be missing some of our more successful ventures. The deep space monitoring stations, for instance. Professor Yithka's restory chambers had stopped functioning entirely, which among her species was typically reserved for moments of existential terror or profound academic revelation. Deep space monitoring stations scattered throughout the local galactic region, the human explained with helpful precision. Passive observation posts, mostly though some of the more advanced installations have been tracking interstellar communications for quite some time. He looked up from his notes with the sort of innocent curiosity that suggested he was about to ask a particularly loaded question. I don't suppose any of your peoples have noticed unusually detailed knowledge of your technological capability appearing in primitive Terran academic publications recently. The Valdric Collective's representatives broke synchronization for the first time in recorded academic history, their individual consciousness briefly asserting itself in what could only be described as collective panic. The Altarian delegation's harmonic humming had shifted from mathematical appreciation to what sounded suspiciously like a funeral dirge composed entirely of prime numbers. The human went back to his notes, his pen scratching across the paper with methodical determination. Each stroke seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet amphitheater, with the sort of precision that suggested someone making a very thorough catalog of everything they'd observed. Professor Yithka found herself staring at her supposedly primitive student with the growing realization that she might have been approaching this entire lecture from the wrong perspective. The human wasn't here to learn about galactic civilization development. He was here to take inventory of it, and judging by the thickness of that notebook, he'd been taking a very thorough inventory indeed. The holographic display of primitive human spacecraft continued rotating in the center of the amphitheater, but it now seemed less like an academic visual aid and more like evidence in a case that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's comfort zone. Professor Yithka's 6 crystalline eyes had developed a nervous twitch that suggested her worldview was undergoing the sort of fundamental restructuring typically associated with religious conversion or complete psychological breakdown. The human continued his methodical note-taking, apparently fascinated by the educational experience of learning about his own species' developmental failures, which would have been charmingly naive, if not for the growing suspicion among the assembled academics that he wasn't actually learning anything so much as confirming information he already possessed in uncomfortable detail. Perhaps, Professor Yithka said with the sort of careful academic diplomacy that suggested she was trying to steer the conversation back towards safer theoretical ground, we should focus on the broader patterns of civilizational development, rather than getting bogged down in specific technological minutiae. The human looked up from his notebook with helpful enthusiasm. Oh, absolutely. Broader patterns are much more instructive. He flipped several pages back with practiced efficiency. For instance, your earlier point about most species developing faster than light communication early in their technological evolution, that's a fascinating observation about galactic development patterns. The ethereal drift representative had stopped flickering between dimensions entirely, which among their people indicated either deep meditative focus, or the quantum equivalent of holding very, very still in hopes that predators wouldn't notice them. Yes. Well, Professor Yithka began, her mandibles clicking with increasingly obvious nervous energy. The development of subspace communication networks is indeed a standard. We've been listening to yours for about 37 cycles now. The human interrupted with casual helpfulness. Quite educational, really. Your peoples have very thorough communication protocols. He consulted his notebook again. The Altarian military frequencies are particularly well organized, and the Valdric Collective's hive mind coordination signals have been absolutely fascinating from a xenobiological perspective. The Altarian delegation's harmonic humming ceased entirely, replaced by the sort of metallic silence that suggested extremely advanced computational matrices, suddenly dedicating all processing power to recalculating risk assessment. The Valdric Collective's representatives had gone from perfect synchronization to what could only be described as collective paralysis, their shared consciousness apparently struggling to process the implications of having been eavesdropped upon by beings they'd considered barely sentient. The human continued with academic enthusiasm. The trade route coordination between your species has been particularly instructive. Very efficient logistics networks, though I have to say, the security protocols around the Nexus shipping lanes could use some work. Not that we've done anything with that information, of course. We've just been observing. Professor Yithka's respiratory chambers had resumed functioning, but only to produce the sort of shallow, rapid breathing typically associated with academic panic or profound existential crisis. Observing shipping lanes. Well, mapping them really, the human clarified with helpful precision. Standard reconnaissance protocols for any developing civilization making contact with established galactic powers. You understand? Due diligence, risk assessment, that sort of thing. He turned another page in his notebook. Your defense station placements are quite logical, by the way, very strategically sound, though I notice you've left some interesting gaps in coverage around the outer spiral arm territory. The Zephyrian scholar's tentacles had wrapped themselves into what appeared to be either a complex mathematical knot, or the xenobiological equivalent of a panic attack. The Omnath representative had shifted through several colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrums, settling on a shade that roughly translated to existential horror with undertones of academic mortification. The human looked around the amphitheater with polite curiosity, as if just noticing the atmosphere of barely contained academic terror that had settled over the classroom like fog over a graveyard. I hope I'm not monopolizing the discussion. I know how important it is for exchange programs to be educational for everyone involved. Exchange programs. The phrase hung in the air with the sort of ominous weight that suggested it might mean something entirely different than what everyone had assumed. Professor Yithka found her voice, though it came out as more of a whisper than her usual confident academic tone. Exchange programs. Oh yes, The human replied with genuine enthusiasm. This is just one of several cultural exchange initiatives Earth has been participating in over the past few cycles. We've got representatives embedded in quite a few galactic institutions now. He flipped through his notebook again. Academic facilities, trade organizations, diplomatic missions, military observer programs. Really, it's been remarkably easy to integrate into galactic society once we figured out the proper approach. The silence that followed was the sort typically associated with the moment when extremely intelligent beings realize they've been systematically outmaneuvered by opponents they hadn't even recognized as opponents. It was the academic equivalent of discovering that the quaint primitive artifact you'd been studying was actually a sophisticated surveillance device that had been cataloging your every move. The human continued writing, his pen moving across the paper with the sort of methodical precision that suggested he was completing a very comprehensive report. Each scratch of ink against paper seemed to echo in the amphitheater with increasing ominousness, like the sound of a very thorough inventory being taken by someone who had been granted unprecedented access to highly classified information. Professor Yith-Ka stared at her supposedly primitive student with the growing realization that she hadn't been conducting an academic lecture about developmental failure. She'd been providing a detailed briefing to a reconnaissance operative who had somehow convinced the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy to give him a front-row seat to their most sensitive strategic assessments. And judging by the efficiency with which he was taking notes, he'd been getting quite an education indeed. The amphitheater had settled into the sort of profound silence typically reserved for funeral services, or the moments before civilizations realize they've made catastrophically poor strategic decisions. The holographic display of primitive human spacecraft continued its cheerful rotation, now serving as perhaps the most ironic visual aid in the history of galactic education, a monument to assumptions that had aged about as well as milk in a supernova. The human closed his notebook with the sort of satisfied finality that suggested he'd completed whatever comprehensive assessment he'd been conducting. The sound echoed through the amphitheater like the closing of a coffin lid, which was probably an apt metaphor for what had just happened to several species' sense of galactic superiority. Professor Yith-Ka had progressed beyond academic panic into the sort of crystalline clarity that comes from having one's entire worldview systematically dismantled by someone who had been politely asking for minor clarification. Her 6 eyes focused on the human with laser intensity, though whether this represented scholarly curiosity or the academic equivalent of a predator sizing up prey was difficult to determine. "I believe," she said with the careful precision of someone choosing each word as if it might be their last, "that there may be some gaps in our current understanding of Terran developmental status." The human smiled with the sort of helpful enthusiasm that had been charming when they'd assumed he was harmless and was now absolutely terrifying in its implications. "Oh, there often are gaps in preliminary assessments. That's why we find these exchange programs so valuable for update galactic databases." He stood up, stretching with the casual ease of someone who had just completed a particularly successful day at the office, which, considering what his actual job appeared to be, was probably exactly what had happened. "Actually, that reminds me," he said, consulting a small device that had materialized from somewhere in his clothing, a device that looked suspiciously like the sort of advanced communication technology that most civilizations took centuries to develop. "I should probably mention that Earth's first contact response fleet finished moving into position around the major galactic transit points about 6 hours ago." The temperature in the amphitheater seemed to drop to somewhere approaching absolute zero. The Altarian delegation's chrome exoskeletons began emitting what could only be described as the harmonics of pure mathematical terror. The Valdric collective's hive mind had apparently decided that individual consciousness was preferable to shared panic and had fractured into 12 separate beings, all of whom were staring at the human with identical expressions of species-wide horror. "First contact. Response fleet." Professor Yith-Ka's voice had acquired the sort of hollow quality typically associated with beings who had just realized they'd been spectacularly, comprehensively and possibly terminally outmaneuvered. "Standard protocol for any civilization transitioning from covert observation to formal diplomatic relations," the human explained with helpful academic precision. "We learned quite a bit from your own historical records about how these transitions typically go. Very instructive case studies about what happens when advanced civilizations underestimate newcomers." He gestured toward the holographic display of primitive human spacecraft with obvious appreciation. Your databases are remarkably thorough about galactic history, particularly the sections dealing with how established powers consistently fail to recognize emerging threats until it's strategically disadvantageous to address them. The irony was so thick it could have been cut with a gravitic manipulation field and served at academic dinner parties for the next several centuries. Here was a classroom full of representatives from the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, gathered to study the failures of primitive species, being lectured on strategic oversight by a member of the very species they'd been using as a cautionary tale about developmental incompetence. The ethereal drift representative flickered back into normal spacetime long enough to emit what might have been a laugh or possibly the quantum equivalent of hysterical sobbing. The Omnath representative had cycled through every color in their species' emotional spectrum and had apparently invented several new ones specifically for this occasion. The human tucked his communication device away with practiced efficiency. The fleet commanders are quite excited about formal first contact, actually. They've been studying galactic diplomatic protocols for quite some time. Your peoples have very well documented procedures for integrating new civilizations into existing power structures. He paused thoughtfully, though I suspect they might want to revisit some of those procedures, given recent developments. Professor Yithka's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, which among her species typically indicated either deep philosophical contemplation or complete cognitive shutdown. Reese's developments. Well, it turns out that when you spend several decades conducting systematic reconnaissance of galactic civilization, while maintaining the pretense of being a primitive species, you end up with quite a comprehensive understanding of existing strategic vulnerability. The human explained with the sort of academic helpfulness that suggested he was genuinely trying to be educational. Very useful for diplomatic negotiations, as I'm sure you can imagine. The assembled students sat in the sort of stunned silence typically associated with prey animals that had just realized the harmless creature they'd been observing was actually an apex predator that had been studying them with considerably more thoroughness than they'd been studying it. The human gathered his notebook and writing implements with methodical precision. I should probably head back to prepare my final report on galactic educational methodologies. This has been incredibly instructive. He looked around the amphitheater with obvious satisfaction. I think Earth's diplomatic corps will be particularly interested in the section about how advanced civilizations consistently underestimate species they classify as primitive. He headed toward the exit, pausing at the doorway to look back at the assembled academics with polite curiosity. Oh, and Professor, you might want to update your curriculum. Case Study 47B appears to have some significant data gap. The door closed behind him with the sort of soft finality that suggested the end of an era specifically. The era in which the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could assume that being technologically sophisticated was the same thing as being strategically competent. Professor Yithka stared at the holographic display of primitive human spacecraft, which continued its cheerful rotation in blissful ignorance of the fact that it had just become the most ironic visual aid in galactic academic history. Somewhere in the depths of space, she realized, there were fleets of actual human warships that bore about as much resemblance to these primitive craft as her advanced civilization bore to the strategic competence they'd just witnessed. The class was, indeed, learning galactic history. They just hadn't realized they were about to become it.